that's awarded annually to by for outstanding scholarship. So it's a real pleasure, of course, to have her here at Penn, and I'm really interested to hear about all the fun stuff she's been doing with her colleagues in geology. So with that, I'm going to shut up and turn it over to Ani.
So I think I need to get screen sharing capability. So I'm not sure.
So someone should make you co-host.
Yeah. Okay, that might be it. Let me see. Nope. And just a quick note, it's not, the geology is towards the end. We're going to do geosciences, mostly oceanography today.
Hi, Anna, you are
we have lots of geology we can discuss. Okay, so let's give this a try. There we go. Okay. Okay, so, you know, so given the fact that, you know, from my limited experience so far, this is going to be me speaking to my slides mostly. And so I would suggest that people who have questions, I have a separate, you know, sort of screen here that I can monitor the chat window. Feel free to type questions in there, or go ahead and sort of unmute yourself and, you know, interrupt me. So, you know, either way works, okay? So I think I wanted to share, one of the things that Mark wanted us to share every week is really sort of what things are going well. So I just wanted us, I wanted to share a picture of our lab meeting this week. I don't know, those of you who remember the Brady Brunch, this is the Brady Bunch, not the Brady Brunch. This is our scalar bunch, and so we just made a nice riff on the opening sequence to that. I think it was in the 70s. So I think even I am a bit young for that era. But anyway, so so things are going as well as we can make it. So let's get started. So in general, you know, when I talk to, when my group and I, you know, when we talk and we sit down and have our lab meetings, you know, we kind of like to encourage people to think about robots as sort of this human blank interface, right? Where we can now substitute this blank with whatever tasks that we are interested for the robot to perform. Now, by acting as the interface, right, these robots sort of help mitigate the dangers, the tedium, and the messiness, or sometimes we call the dull, the dangerous, and the dirty, right, of the task. And really, the purpose is to extend our abilities to interact with the world. Now, of course, the task, right, of building these interfaces becomes increasingly hard as the environment becomes less structured, more expansive, and dynamic. So if we think about the many robots that we use in space, at home, in surgery, on the road, in this context, the role of autonomy is really to mediate the mismatches in temporal and spatial scales between sort of human thought processes and actions and the processes that surround us and that we interact with, okay? So one area that we've been working in that really sort of, you know, this idea really comes into focus is sort of in the geosciences, right? And so according to the American Geoscience Institute, geoscience is the study of the earth. And so this really encompasses everything and anything that is earth related, right? So things like oceans, atmosphere, rivers, lakes, ice sheets, glaciers, soils, terrain, what's inside the, you know, what's beneath the soil, what's inside the earth, and anything that has, you know, that sort of it involves living beings, right, interacting with any of these systems, okay? And so while each of these sort of earth components, right, encompasses very different landscapes and habitats, they do have certain, things that they do share, right? They have aspects of them that they do share. And so, for one thing to keep in mind is they're usually, they're expansive. They exhibit many different spatial and temporal scales, okay? And so this is the classic multi-scale problem. They can be very difficult for humans to access, right, and interact with, or they have, regions that exhibit that property. And all of this sort of contribute to our limited understanding, right, of their complexities. And so there are significant uncertainties associated with what we know about them. And so in this context, I'm using the word uncertainty sort of really, really broadly, okay? But it's going to call into sort of these notions of uncertainties that we are more sort of familiar with in terms of model, in terms of sensor and actuation and so on. So in our lab, right, much of our focus is on ocean sciences, and we think about how to leverage teams of robots to provide the necessary spatial temporal coverage of this very complex environment, right? And the purpose, of course, is so that we can get a better understanding of the fundamental physics that drives the various physical, biological, as well as chemical processes that sort of happen in the ocean. And so here, just to give you a sense, this thing, and if people can see my mouse, right, the CFD simulation in the middle, that is actually an actual simulation that was developed based on the leak, the Deepwater Horizon oil spill a while ago. It's I guess at this point it's 20. Okay, I'm recording on this computer. Is that okay? Okay, good. So for some reason, okay, there we go. Okay, so let's get back. So from a robotics perspective, right? In the water, the vehicle dynamics ends up being very tightly coupled with the environmental dynamics, given that this environment it's a high inertia environment, and so that makes the controls problem, the vehicle controls problem, hard. You can rely on remote control, but of course there's a lack of reliable underwater communication, right? And so underwater, you really, Wi-Fi just does not work. I think it penetrates at most like 10 centimeters, right, below the water, and that's about it. You're basically done. And so existing technology, right, underwater communication technology, it's very, very low bandwidth, and it's pretty lossy. And then underwater perception is mostly near field. And so if you are interested in sort of, doing mapping of man-made structures, right, there are things like sonar that works very similar to LiDAR, where you can actually, do sort of these type of point cloud-based sort of SLAM mapping strategies. But in fact, most of those things don't really work that well if you're sort of more interested in natural environments, especially underwater, right? And in fact, those beautiful pictures of coral reefs that are super, super colorful. I mean, a lot of that is just very, very carefully doctored images, right? And so, and in fact, I would say that, if you think about the ocean, it's mostly water, not surprisingly. There's actually not, it's mostly empty space. So, what can you see? And, oftentimes the water is murky, it's dark, there's not enough light. And so, vision is just, it ends up being really limited modality, sensing modality, okay? So in this talk today, I'm gonna sort of focus on sort of two components of this loop that I've shown you. And so one is going to be about sort of, the environment. How do we tackle, figure out, develop strategies where we can actually get the robots to where they have to go in order to get useful data that helps us do good reconstruction, right, of the environment, of the environmental models. And really a lot of this is thinking about how you can use these models to do prediction, okay? And then we're going to talk about the challenges of inter-robot communication and, sort of when these robots have to operate in these environments that have significant dynamics. So I'm going to start briefly with Hsieh's, some of the work that Hsieh has been doing. I know that Hsieh is going to be she's being asked to do one of these student seminars. So I'm going to keep this very, very high level so that I don't steal her thunder when it's, when she does her presentation. But let's just sort of, use this as a starting point. So let's assume that we have, some workspace that we're interested in. And most of this work I'm going to talk about today, we're going to focus on 2D with time varying components. And then, we can, a lot of these things extend to 3D, but there's sort of, caveats that we have to be a little careful about when we think about 3D. But let's start here. So we have this space. We have some kind of a spatio-temporal process. This could be an oil spill. This could be some kind of an algae bloom that you're interested in tracking. And so, the question is, how do we do this? So one way we can think about this is to sort of cut the space up into smaller regions, right? And then we can think about applying some form of a spatial grid or some kind of spatial discretization of this flow field. And so we just think about, these are basically a collection of XY points on a grid. You have your team of robots, and we're going to, in most cases, we have to assume that the number of robots that we have is going to be less than the total regions that we want to have coverage for. And you can think about this both in terms of how, in terms of the sensing radius, as well as, how big the space is and how many resources you have, okay? And of course, the robots are going to have some kind of dynamics. And really, the objective is to be able to develop some kind of a adaptive sampling strategy and tracking strategy so the team can be able to track this process. So the approach, right, that Hsieh has come up with is really this adaptive sampling using iterative POD. And POD is basically principal orthogonal decomposition. So one way to think about POD is it's really this sort of, high sort of the extension of principal component analysis or PCA, but now you're really explicitly taking the time variations and the time modes, the temporal modes into consideration in addition to the spatial modes. And so in this way, so we have our M regions. We're going to assume that we're going to be able to take measurements in a subset of those regions, right? And then using sort of this variant of POD, we can then develop what we call a reduced order model. And basically, the idea here is you extract what the dominant dynamical sort of eigenmodes are, okay? And then you use a subset of those modes in order to do the reconstruction of a model for the process itself. And then you can then use this model to do to estimate the measurements that you would get if you had sensors in the regions that you cannot monitor, right? And then using all that data, you can now sort of pick the next set of sampling locations. And then the way you would do this is you want to be able to think about, the subspace, that the measurement subspace, right, that you would be able to cover, right, at this new iteration. And you want to make sure that that sort of subspace is as closely aligned to the subspace that the reduced order model is living in. And then basically you assign your robot. So there's a task assignment problem here. There's a planning problem here at sort of stage 4. And then you sort of, once you've done that, you have to reiterate the entire process. So what is really neat is that Hsieh has come up with a way where you can now, distribute this approach, which is historically done in a centralized fashion, right? In a way that is done in a completely distributed fashion, okay? And so, oh, one thing I just realized when I shared my screen, 1 second, I wanna make sure this is optimized for videos. So here, let's go back. So this is just a, so here's our dye experiment, which is in the upper left-hand corner. The robots are sort of, so we project that dye experiment onto our big water tank in the lab. And then the robots are sort of, we simulate the robot measurements, okay? So we're tracking the concentration of this dye as it sort of gets dispersed within this flow. So if you look at that flow video, there's actually these flashing circles in the background. So this is actually this process is not a diffusion driven process. This process actually is driven by these, so flows in the tank are actually being created, and they're really sort of it's a periodic flow that is being created. And then the discs are actually mixing the liquid. And so in this way, what you're seeing, the dye is actually sort of getting dispersed in sort of so this is definitely not a sort of, you know, diffusion driven process, right? And so what you're seeing on the right-hand side, the grayscale image, that is basically the model that Hsieh's technique is able to reconstruct, and that's our reduced order model. So at every iteration, you are taking in new data, you're assimilating that data into your reduced order model, so you're updating that model. You're using the updated model to do inference and then sort of redeploy, right? And so this is, so what you're seeing is we're actually getting some really good reconstruction in terms of what we can do, okay? But, you know, of course, so that is an example of what I would say, you know, we're thinking about things at a point to point, at a pointwise, in terms of a pointwise measurement, right? So is the image coming, are the slides coming out okay from here? On my other screen, they look a little bit choppy, but
yeah,
let me know if, you know, if things can be improved.
They got very pixelated when you did.
So you know, one thing that I would say that really, you know, ideally, you don't really want to be dealing with sort of point-to-point measurements, right? Or you want to collect, you know, sort of carry around these point-to-point measurements. But instead, right, if we think about how we as humans, right, think, our thought processes often sort of work at the feature level, right? And rather than the pixel level. Okay. So the images got very choppy. So let me go back. Let me see if I can switch this back real quickly so that it's not optimized for video, and then we can sort of swap it again. I'll swap it back again as other videos come along. So one thing to say is just that, you know, we want to reason and interact with our environment sort of based on features, and from those features sort of the associated structures, right, that we then discern. And so the question is, you know, whether there is structure sort of in the dynamics that drives these processes in the ocean. Right, so bottom line is we want to move beyond sort of thinking at things at the pixel level, but really now reason about things at the feature level. Okay, so here's a set of movies that is coming down in this next slide, and let's see, it's a little choppy, but it's not too terrible. Okay. So this is, so on your right-hand side, this is the basically surface currents. This is done through satellite data that NASA did. And these are all the surface currents, sort of, this is integrated over several months, okay? So what you're seeing are really the streamlines of the flows. On the right-hand side, what you're seeing is that's the Gulf of Mexico. This is what we call the Gulf of Mexico loop current system. And the Gulf Stream is really this red region right here. And during certain times of the year, the Gulf Stream sort of comes into the Gulf of Mexico, and then eventually comes in far enough that this eddy gets shed, okay? So this is what we call this eddy shedding event, okay? And so, in fact, if you know, sort of look at these videos for a long time, what you see is there is in fact significant structure, right, in the moving water, okay? But really, for us to be able to sort of discern, right, what the structure is, we want to be able to, let me see, hold on, I think there might be another message coming in. Nope, I think that's good. So these are ocean currents, okay? So these are surface currents, by the way. So the question was, are these mostly wind or ocean currents? Okay, so these are ocean currents. There is another site that I can send you that shows you the wind currents, and that is another really cool website. But we'll leave that towards the end. And so we do see a lot of structure in here, and in fact, the thing that I tell people is that if you actually look at the ocean, right, through the right set of dynamical systems lens, you can see sort of one class of these structures, right? So A, the structures are there, B, the structures are in fact coherent, and we actually have names for these structures. And so one of the class of these coherent structures is called these Lagrangian coherent structures, or LCS. And they actually give us a lot of information because they actually help us characterize the flow, right, or the transport in the flows. And so what you're seeing here, so in 2D, right, LCS are really just sort of one-dimensional boundaries that exhibit what we call these finite time Lyapunov exponent measures. And sort of what FTLEs are really measuring, right, is how it's a local measure of how fast a region in the flow is expanding. And so the figure on the left shows the surface currents. These are surface sea currents in Monterey Bay. And then the figure on the right-hand side is showing the FTLE field computed using those surface sea surface currents, okay? And so these Lagrangian coherent structures are these red lines that are showing up in that FTLE field on the right-hand side. Now, from a robotics perspective, right, LCS are important because they first of all, right, sort of denote the regions in the flow that exhibit sort of distinct dynamics, okay? So actually, so first of all, the figure that you're seeing here is, this is an optimal, an energy and time optimal path for a vehicle. So the way they pose this is you pose the optimal trajectory generation problem, and then you take the background, the current, right, into account during the optimization. And what you see is the fact that the robot actually, the optimal fuel and time optimal path lands or tends to chase after one of these boundaries, okay? And so here, this is the robot is in the magenta diamond, and the green X here is, that's the goal location. And so, and then sort of from a sort of dynamics perspective, so what the animation on the right is showing you is that passive particles, if you seed sort of passive particles on opposite sides of one of these boundaries, you see that the white particles don't really mix with the black particles. And so they kind of delineate these, what we call no mix boundaries. And the implication here is that the dynamics of the flow on one side of the boundary is fundamentally different than the dynamics on the other side of that, dynamics of the flow on the other side of the boundary, okay? And so really, one can think about sort of LCS as these time-varying extensions, right, of stable and unstable manifolds of a saddle point in a sort of time-independent dynamical system, okay? And so, but of course, the downside, of course, right, so these are, if we think about them in that context, these ends up being topological features, right? And of the dynamical system. And so that means that these are really global structures, okay? And the reason why we can get them is because they are, sort of, they are revealed by sampling that flow field. So there's a question here about, are there different models of LCS for turbulent versus laminar flows? The answer is no, because LCS is defined in a very particular way. And so, but there are different types of coherent structures. And so there are different types of coherent structures and coherent sets. And depending on the definition and the technique that you use to extract them, you would get different things. And we'll touch upon this a little bit in the following slides, okay? And so here, the idea here, right, is that, if we can better exploit, right, our team of robots, then we can actually, leverage, right, robot teams to be able to provide the coverage and of the space and increase the spatial-temporal sampling resolution of the flow field, right? And the idea is that the robots can then collect this data. The data can then be processed, possibly in a distributed fashion, to obtain this global description of the flow dynamics that can be maintained and updated in real time, which can then be used again to improve your deployments and so on and so forth, okay? So that's kind of, you know, the end goal of, you know, if we can do this, okay? So just to give you a sense of how, you know, powerful these things can be, so this is a, so this is just a simulation of a, so this is a periodic flow field where you have an LCS in the middle, so that's shown to you by the red lines. And in this simulation, we simulated sort of a fake sort of, you know, dispersion of, you know, black dots, okay, that the origin of that is denoted by the red X, which is towards the middle bottom of the movie. And so what you're saying is that, you know, the locations, right, of these coherent structures or these LCS, right, like not only impacts where these black dots go, but they actually give us a chance to be able to predict, right, where they're going to end up if we knew where these things are, okay? So this is really exciting for many reasons, right? First of all, if you think about this in the context of planning and navigation, right, the LCS, if you can find where these boundaries are, they really sort of create this network of superhighways for marine vehicles for them to be able to leverage and execute, right, sort of very energy efficient plans. But sort of from a geophysical fluid perspective, right, then if we can sort of figure out where these structures are, now that potentially gives us a very compact way, right, to sort of properly represent a map of this dynamical system, sort of map in the context of robotics maps and not in the context of dynamical systems maps, right? And then this map can then be sort of, you know, updated in real time, and then we can then use this map to sort of deploy, you know, do a better job of improving the deployments of our robot, right? So this isn't this a great idea? But of course, there's no free lunch, and you know, getting these LCS is actually pretty, it's expensive, okay? And so similar to stable and unstable manifolds in a time invariant dynamical systems, you have these repelling and attracting structures, right, for these LCS. And usually the way, you know, people find these things is you get your flow field. So this is the entire flow field of the region that you're interested in. You have to now seed particles, right? And then you have to advect those particles forward in time over a fixed time window. So this is where the finite time comes from. And then you have to compute the Cauchy-Green deformation tensor, and then the FTLE is actually given to you, right, as a function of the maximum eigenvalue of that Cauchy-Green deformation tensor. And that basically gives you a measure of how fast things are, you know, how fast trajectories diverge in that part of the flow field, right? And so now you actually, for you to get the entire field, you have to do this, right? You know, you have to window this through the entire data set. And so, so one thing to keep in mind is that, you know, number one, this can get costly very quickly. And this operation you're doing once in order to get one set of structures, and these are these repelling structures. For you to get the attracting structures, you actually have to compute the FTLE backwards in time, right? And part of this is because they're, you know, another way to think about it, the attracting structures, they have a direction of stability. And so for you to be able to figure this out, you actually have to advect that flow field backwards in time. So this is even worse because that means you need to know not just the entire flow data, you need to know the entire flow data for the entire period of time that you're interested in order to, you know, to extract this data, okay? And then here's the worst part. So this technique, this technique is only good at extracting hyperbolic coherence, these hyperbolic LCS. Hyperbolic LCS are sort of these boundaries, and at least in 2D, are these boundaries that trace, you can actually follow one of these boundaries and eventually it should trace to either a stationary or stagnation point in the flow. Whereas you have elliptical LCS, right, and these do not undergo the kinds of exponential stretching in sort of a finite time window, and therefore it ends up being, you know, you have to use different techniques for you to extract elliptical LCS, okay? But nevertheless, we have, you know, we started out, right, in this area, partly because we were interested in asking this question of, can you sort of develop strategies that allow us to map these structures. And so we have developed some techniques that allows robots, if you have an initial prior as to where a boundary is, then you can actually use techniques that sort of fuse the local flow data to allow the team to be able to maintain this sort of boundary straddling formation, okay? And this is sort of work that we did with my previous postdoc and previous student. And so here, this is the old tank that we used to have at Drexel. So we validated, we can create these flows that exhibit these types of features in the tank and be able to validate this. Now, one tricky thing to call your attention to the bottom movie here. So if you notice, this is like the same region, but the flow is reversed, okay? And part of this is that in general, it's for you to figure out where an actual LCS out in the world is, you actually have to get data. You have to do a lot of processing of the data and then figure out if it's, did you get an attracting, did you get a repelling one? Did you get anything at all? Most often, sometimes you get nothing. And so it ends up being very data expensive, very time consuming. And so what we did for us to validate our strategy to track an attractive LCS is we basically took our flow data from, the same flow data that we had in the movie on top, at the top, and then basically reverse time and in the direction of the flow so that we can create an attracting structure. And so these are sort of these tricks that, we have to employ for us to be able to be more efficient in terms of how we go about validating some of our techniques. Okay. So it's nice to have so it's this idea that, in general, we like having maps, right, as roboticists. But I think really the idea here is that we, in dynamical, sort of insist in environments, that are dynamical, right, so sort of time varying environments, the dynamics themselves is this complicated interplay, right, of the stable and unstable, dynamical modes. And it's really about finding the right features, right, that we need to find the right features to be able to do a good job of building this map that we're going after, right? And really, we think that coherent structures, right, whether it be the LCS or something else, is potentially this window in allowing us to be able to, so those are the features, right, that we are interested in, okay? So I will have a little bit more to say about this, but I want to sort of show you the power, some of the things that you can do, if in fact we can do this at the large scale, okay? So let's go back, and I'm going to use this Gulf of Mexico region as an example. And now we're going to think about, you want to be able to deploy your robots into this pretty large space. And then you want them to be able to be constantly sort of, collecting data. You want them to be able to upload this data somehow, and then for you to be able to build these kinds of models. But how would you coordinate them, right? And so one thing we thought about is, well, since Gyre seems to be these sort of, vortices, right? They seem to be very prevalent in these types of environments. What we can think about is, again, we sort of employ what we know from robotics, that we would decompose the space, okay? And you can decompose the space, and the idea here is that you can now sort of extract these into these circular orbits, and you would have robots that are sort of roughly going along in these circular orbits that are in close proximity to one another. We can then sort of build this proximity graph that describes, right, how these robots sort of move around. And if they neighbor each other, then there's a chance for them to come together and exchange information, right, and exchange data. And so in this way, we can then think about them, we can abstract them into sort of these, sort of robots on little circular orbits on a grid somehow. And if you notice this little animation, when two of these red dots or red robots come close together, they turn blue. And that means that they've come into communication range of one another. And this is an opportunity for them to actually communicate, okay? So the neat thing is that, so now the question is, well, how can I get, if enough robots to be able to come together and communicate so that then this isn't, they can actually exchange data and propagate information throughout the entire network. And so this is the part where we can think about, right, modeling these robots as oscillators, where the robots themselves, right, because they're deployed in their own sort of gyre-like flow region, that gyres has a natural frequency in which the robots are circulating in. And then we can think about sort of adding control in order to sort of, you know, speed up or slow down, right, that oscillator, okay? So that's kind of this idea. And so now we are trying to solve what we call this sort of rendezvous problem, right? This pairwise rendezvous problem. But we want to do this such that, you know, and the pairs of neighboring robots all get a chance to rendezvous, but in such a way that eventually they can pass information to the entire team. And so if I think about two neighboring orbits, right, I can think about this rendezvous zone, and I can think about the conditions under which the robots sort of enter that rendezvous zone, and the amount of time they spend within that rendezvous zone to exchange data, okay? And so outside of that rendezvous zone, then they're outside of their communication range, so they can't talk to one another. And so this actually, so if you look at just sort of, you know, two robots in this particular case, it is very similar to the coupled oscillator problem, except that now what you're looking at is, you know, you have these robots that are circulating, right? And you're really thinking about what is the time window when each of them enter their rendezvous zone. So at what sort of frequencies, you know, can you guarantee that they will both enter the rendezvous region, you know, hopefully at the same time, and spend as much time in rendezvous when they're in that region, okay? And so then this really sort of, I'm just gonna go through this since we're kind of running short on time. The way to think about this is we're trying to compute, right? So if you look at the schematic at the bottom here, this is the time, so this shaded region is the time window in which the one robot is in the rendezvous zone. And then the bottom line is with the shaded regions is the time window that the second robot is in the rendezvous zone. And so now the coupled oscillator problem is really about matching those two windows up so those two windows overlap. And that problem can in fact be posed, right? So there's a computational geometry, you know, sort of equivalent problem. And it's this idea of, you know, given so that when you compute the bounds on the time windows for both robots, you end up with this sort of these bounds, which are shown to you by the red lines here, okay? And so if the red lines are too close and you don't encompass any sort of pair of integer numbers, and the reason why they're integer numbers because you're thinking now about periods, right, in which every robot is going around in a circle, and so it's about the frequency and the number of periods that they spend how long it takes them to come back into that rendezvous zone. It sort of maps to this sort of integer programming problem where you're saying, well, can I somehow figure out, right, what is the flatness of these two bounds, and if there's enough room in here for me to fit sort of pairs of integer numbers that I can pick to set the frequency for the individual robots in such a way that ensures the robots will always come in to the rendezvous region and effectively synchronize, okay? And so Hsieh, I'm not going to spend too much time on this because Hsieh has you know, I think she has done one of these talks before, but you know, she'll probably be giving another one given her recent results. But what is really cool about this problem is that we took something that was traditionally sort of this very algorithmic approach to solving the rendezvous problem, and we mapped this into this sort of very classical nonlinear dynamical systems problem of trying to synchronize coupled oscillators, right? Synchronize these nonlinear coupled oscillators. And then through this analysis, what we showed is that, you know, guaranteeing rendezvous is actually very intricately tied to the density of, you know, rational ratios of the difference between the periodicity of one robot with the other. And because we've done this analysis now, what we've shown is that not only is it, you know, for them, it's actually the conditions under which rendezvous will occur, but also the fact that and then what you can do in order to ensure the next rendezvous. So there's a question here. I see that the robot was not modeled as a stochastic oscillator. No, this is the beauty of this work, and this is in Hsieh's sort of frontiers paper. So you don't have to model this as a stochastic oscillator, because even when you add noise to this, because the rendezvous condition is so intricately tied to the density of the rational numbers, you can in fact come up with bounds very easily as to what happens when you have sort of uncertainties in your arrival, sort of in your arrival times into that rendezvous zone. And so we can talk about this offline, but Hsieh is the person that you should reach out to, because there's some pretty cool results there that will require some more time and effort for us to sit there and get through. But let me just sort of, so one thing to note is that we can in fact, so now you have a way to sort of synchronize the entire team. And this, can be mapped onto essentially a minimum time optimal control problem. And the way you do the synchronization is you effectively do a distributed sort of consensus-based type approach, where you can get the team to agree, right, to synchronize to a particular frequency. And then that, by choosing that frequency carefully, you basically can ensure that the entire team synchronizes. And so at any point in time, any two robots are communicating. But if you look at the system across a long enough window of time, then eventually, every robot gets a chance to, you can pass messages along through the network, okay? So I'm not gonna, so we have basically sort of extended this, taken some of these ideas and applied it to sort of doing distributed patrolling of large environments for ground robots. And then we can show the fact that because we have such a, good understanding, sort of tight bounds on times for when things happen, you can in fact provide sort of guarantees as to how long information is going to propagate throughout the network. And so, and those kinds of issues. But let me just sort of, end with a few sort of quick summary about things that we are doing. So Hsieh has taken some of this work and then talked about how you can then compose resilient networks by thinking about leveraging mobility, right? And then be able to think about small resilient graphs, and then how you can take those template graphs. So this is work she's doing with David Saldana and Daigo Shishika. And then Hannes, who's a visiting student from EPFL, so he basically took some of this idea from Hsieh's work, from Yannis Kantaro's work, Yannis, who's a postdoc with George, and then Tahiya's work, and thought about how do we do sort of these distributed adaptive sampling, where now that you can do updates in a completely asynchronous fashion, okay? Tahiyya has taken her work, and now really address how do you fuse multi-scale data, where you now have data coming in from a heterogeneous team of robots. And then, so we have a very new effort here. So Mon is a student that spent last summer with us, and we're trying to understand how you can, infuse our knowledge of physics and to develop learning strategies, right? Sort of that allows us to build models that can give us good prediction of the dynamics, okay? So what you're seeing here in this video is basically our simulation of that vortex shedding example. And the figure on the right, that M actually is the actual model. And then the figure on the left is sort of the neural network based model that was trained, okay? And then, so Ariella has taken some of these ideas in terms of planning and flow fields and actually apply this to control and planning for micro robots. And the idea here is the force field that is generated by that external magnetic field, right, is very similar to flows in the ocean. So we can think about doing planning by leveraging the topology that can be created with the magnetic field. And then sort of just to end, so we thought, at the time we got into geology, we thought, well, we are looking for structures in the water, so we can look for structures in the earth, right? And what is, an obvious structure in the earth is sediment layers, right? So this is interesting. And what we're realizing, so we're kind of a year and a half into this project, and what we're realizing is obviously they're all called geosciences, but depending on what geoscience you do, it's actually very, very different. So this particular field of geology, right, the challenge here is, you know, it's not clear these, what constitutes an interesting structure to one geologist may not always transfer to another geologist, or the interpretation of the geology from one geologist is not always transferable to the interpretation of the other geologist, right? And so in this way, looking at the same pictures, you can actually, two geologists might end up with two conclusions as to what exactly happened to the Earth, right, and how those particular formations came to be. And so now we're trying to sort of, and this has presented, you know, very unique challenges for us, because, you know, this notion of how, you know, what are the features, how are these features measurable, how are they quantifiable, are working on that aspect of the problem. And of course, this is coupled with the fact that just robotics in the field is super, super challenging. You know, you're always faced with a very difficult perception problem, and sort of, you know, all of that rolled into one. So I'm out of time. Just a quick, very quick thank you to all our collaborators. And then if people have more questions, please ask.
Hi, Ani, can you hear me? Maybe it's your maybe.
Okay, so I gotta make, let me stop recording first. So. Okay, so can I comment on the kinds of structures people look for in geological systems? Yes, and that's a really hard question to answer. So one thing, let me pull up, Charity, do you think I can share that picture again, the screen again? So I wanted to show, it's easier to mention this with a picture. Okay, so let's see. Okay, I am the host now, so let me just share that again. So CJ, one thing to take a look at the picture here, if I can get it back up. Okay, so you see the sediment layers, right? And so usually what happens is they would go into a canyon and they're looking for what they call nonconformities. And so what a nonconformity would be is if you have sediment layers that are laid this way on this side of the canyon, then you would expect it to sort of be at the same orientation on that side of the canyon. And if there's any kind of mismatch, that is potentially an interesting place because there might have been a fault or there might be some kind of sort of geological phenomena that basically push the sediment layers into bizarre orientations. And so what they're really interested oftentimes is they want to know what the angle that particular sediment layer is in full three-dimensional space. And then whether, you know, sort of the way geologists mostly take their measurements by hand. And so then what happens is they always want to have sort of this sort of normal view to the rock surface. And so what ends up happening is, you know, for them, the drone is actually a really interesting platform because they can, in fact, get that ability to get that view, but then existing commercial drones don't have the ability to automatically extract that data for them. And so these are things that, you know, so they're interested in faults, they're interested in anytime there's something that is not the same as everything else around it. And so I think that's the part that's very hard to quantify. So thanks everyone for coming.
Okay, great. Yes, it is 12 o'clock on the dot. Thank you, Ani, once again. This was amazing for definitely jumping in for our virtual grass seminar series. We will see you all next Friday. We have a University of Michigan speaker, I can't tell you his last name, but I don't want to butcher it myself. So yes, we hope you have a wonderful weekend. Be safe, everyone, and thank you all again.
Thanks again for coming, guys. Have a good one.